Hi everyone, I'm Kirill, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Taurus. So we are the SaaS intelligence for all layers of the card payment industry. So we help issuers, acquirers, PSPs, merchants to better understand their unit costs of the card transactions and through transparency to optimize their profitability. So today the goal is to discuss a bit to how can we extract more value from the existing data stream. So we're here talking about the card payment data that is typically available for the players from this industry. I have it here. So nowadays, generally, card payments industry is a kind of low margin, high volume market. And in order to succeed here, you need to be competitive yet profitable at the same time, which typically means that you should be quite financially efficient. And in order to do this, you need to be over control on tiny bits and pieces of your transactional P&L, which may be coming from extracting more value from the data that you have. Because what we see currently that far not always that's happening. And generally, so this kind of slide, you know probably better than me. So generally, there are different layers out there. And scheme fees have been quite some time overlooked. So there were a lot of discussions about interchange back then, while scheme fees were kind of a bit in the shadow part of that. And actually, what we're seeing in different regions that when interchange started being regulated, so actually scheme fees are growing even faster than generally over there. And but the idea that they could be quite sufficient in terms of the transactional costs. So what we see, they might be up like 70, 80% of transactional costs. They're always growing, complexity is increasing. So as any complex system, the card payment industry turns to kind of preserve itself by increasing complexity. And on the player side, quite often this is managed semi-manually. So then typically not all of the players are keeping up with all the changes that are happening out there. So if we look at the universe of the fees and how we split it internally here at Taurus, so there are the fees which can be predicted at transactional level. So we call them transactional ones. Typically, depending on the type of the business or each versus acquiring, they may be up to like 75 to 90% of the costs. And besides that, there are the ones so-called like other or fixed fees, which by default do not depend on the volumes that they're doing within the network, but still you have to pay them. So then usually when you start, it means that's kind of a matter of scale. So you need to grow to some certain extent in order to have your fixed costs not hitting you very hard on your cost basis. On the other hand, the gap that we see in the market that when a principal member, like let's say acquirer, gets invoices from the networks, they're aggregated at portfolio level. So it's their task to then try to allocate those costs down to a single transaction, to a single merchant, to a single product. And again, what we see, a lot of players are still doing kind of guesses instead of calculation, because the only proper way to do it is to recalculate it from scratch, which is quite cumbersome, and then you need to maintain all the models up to date. But this demanded transparency may bring some certain values here. So first, it will give you the idea of, okay, what's exactly your unit margin here? So I'm acquirer, I have like 1,000 merchants. How much money I'm exactly making on those ones? Or even going deeper into a single merchant. So, okay, merchant is profitable, but then within that merchants are all types of transactions are profitable, because we see that sometimes portfolio-wise, business might be looking healthy, but when you drill down to merchant levels, so like up to 10-15% of merchants are not that profitable because they were mispriced. And then if you go deeper, then the same can be happening on the types of transaction level. On the other hand, merchants are struggling getting transparency from their acquiring partners, because sometimes there's a scheme, one number called scheme fee, which could hardly be explained. So that's why also transparency will like add value here, but also being able to explicitly tell what is this about? So how we allocated those costs here, but also it would help technically to find some errors, because as all complex systems, there are some errors in the systems, and then the faster you find them, the faster you will fix them, and there will be like less financial impact based on that. Currently, we see that generally, like globally, the industry is losing billions due to those inefficiencies. So we call it kind of some confusion that exists out there. And confusion is there because exactly the complexity of the scheme fees and then like the dynamic changes on that. And there are two major reasons. So on the principal member level, so typically banks or issuers, acquirers end up overpaying the fees by not really understanding what exactly they're paying for. And when they go to transactional level, so the issue here is that they cannot explicitly allocate those transactional costs down to single unit level, to transaction, to product, which then prevents them to explain it to their merchant, but also then creates also some potential errors and like inefficiencies in terms of calculating unit level profitability. So how we see the data analytics evolving here. So now we as Toros, we kind of are providing intelligence on top of the data. So that's kind of the first step. Okay, you have your data streams. And our point here is typically, it's not about getting more data in-house. It's more about extracting value from the data that you have. And that's the tricky thing. And then the first step would be to provide intelligence with some tools. So now with these all discussions around AI, so first you still need to have some deterministic calculation, especially if it's a rule-based cost calculation in the back. And then you have humans right now as users to those things. So you have intelligent analysis used by humans, and then there's some providing some insights. So we're moving towards there. So we're adding kind of agentic AI interfaces when some human labor is replaced by additional digital labor, and then there is in the end this kind of combination. So what are the use cases that you can automate with AI agents, or what are still the ones that should be manual? So meaning AI will not solve, it's not a crystal ball solving all the problems. So you still need to have some deterministic calculation in the back, and then you can add some reasoning on top exactly by kind of emulating the human logic. So if I have this and this and this, that's what would be the best next step, for example? What should I do with this? What are the areas should I look at? But basically, so it's still going forward would be a combination, but it would additionally require some interfaces. So now we have, for example, as an output, we have the web-based interface, so we can use the dashboards, push some buttons as a human user. We can be extracting the data for be then sent to some customers' systems to then enrich their BI, whatever. And then also, so now there's kind of a new interface that actually this data can be fed to other agents. And we already had those discussions with existing and prospect customers that say, okay, hey, we're using some AI-based analytics internally. Can you then feed the outputs to that? And then we're creating this kind of AI to AI interfaces in the end. Again, it sounds maybe quite fancy, but in the end, it's more about just like sending some data over API, so it's not a rocket science in the end there. But still, that's how we see the data extraction and data analytics will evolve going forward. So talking about some use cases here, so why transparency matters? So what can we actually have from analyzing this data? So some fresh ones would be about, first, unleashing some of the errors. So sometimes the networks also do make mistakes. And then this lack of transparency and these mistakes and then inherited down the whole payments value chain. So to principal members, then down to PSPs, merchants, and so on. So we recently, for example, figured out that one network were changing the frequency of billing for one specific fee across some countries. And for some of the countries, probably the settings were updated not that correctly, so they kept on billing it twice. So our system caught it when doing the reconciliation for one of our customers, and then they could open a claim and get their like overpaid couple of hundreds of euros back quite fast. The other thing that we see and hear from both ends on the acquirers and merchants is the providing interchange plus pricing, because sometimes I see plus is seen as a kind of super transparent thing. But the devil is in the details. So usually the devil is, the question is how actually you calculate the scheme fees there. Because what we heard and hear from merchants that, okay, I'm getting fully the markup. If it's intra-EAA, so interchange is also quite well understandable. The scheme fee is just one number. I have no other options rather than to believe it. So can you explain me a bit? And then it could be a tough question for acquirer because they also deallocated it somehow. They might be using some portfolio average. But here, so our goal, our idea that if we bring this kind of, again, deterministic rule-based calculation, emulating the logic, so how it should be calculated based on the rules by the networks, then you can also provide a very clear explanation to the merchants as well. The next one would be about, from the acquiring end, to calculating the unit level profitability and making sure that you are pricing your merchants fairly, meaning that you're not overpricing for some like low-cost transactions like domestic, I don't know, consumer cards, for example. But at the same time, if we see some, I don't know, international corporate cards growing, it actually should be a separate price because it costs you more. And then by being able to allocate very accurately all the fees down there, so you also have this transparent database discussion with your customer. And the last but not least here is that the complexity of the system is driven by one of the things that the fees are updated quite often. And then again, it's up to you who is trying to emulate this or trying to analyze this to understand what would be the impact of those. So having the database, the data-driven approach, you're able to do some, we call it what-if impact analysis. So for example, there's some new fees announced as coming into place in April, and then that usually happens a couple of months ahead, or even more. And then we can emulate what would be the impact of this new specific fee introduced to the whole business of the customer, to the, let's say, acquirer, or to some specific merchants, or some specific merchant segments or types of transactions, and then they can do a couple of things. Either, if it's blended rate that they have, they may estimate the impact on their profitability and should they reprice the merchant upfront or not. But if it's interchange plus, then actually within the kind of customer excellence process, they're able to communicate it to the merchant ahead that, hey guys, you might expect, I don't know, a couple of bips of growth in your transactional costs starting from this date, but it's not because of like us charging you more, but it's because there's some change in the schemes, in the scheme fees. So again, that will be creating like less tension and more transparency and more customer excellence sort of across the players. So basically, the data is here. There are the ways to analyze it. So one of the key questions is kind of, do you want to know the truth? Because typically when we start talking with the prospect customers, it's not always the answer there at yes. So that's why that's a very important question to be asked to you first. So if you want to know the truth, there are the ways to analyze it going forward. So this is it. Thank you so much. Looking forward for discussion here.